Often happens after interesting symposium that good ideas arouse, and this happened in Copenhagen in 1996, and a day after, going to Louisiana, which is a beautiful museum near Copenhagen, and on the train, thinking of all those interesting discussion we had and meeting we had, we were thinking that probably could have been very interesting to make some presentation of the history, of the human history of those people who were present in that occasion, who had met Foulkes, and could have been a good idea to put together everything and leave this to all people who are interested to know this part of the story of group analysis.
There was a seminar in this conference about the history of group analysis, and there were senior members of the Group Analytic Society and from all over the world present who talked about their personal encounters with Foulkes, and that after that we developed the idea that we should have a kind of possibility for those who are interested in group analysis, in the theory and the practice, that they get to know Foulkes better as a person by those people who met him personally. And the idea of the film is to give you a picture of him as a person, how he worked as a therapist and as a psychoanalyst and group analyst, especially in groups, and through the encounters really people had with him personally. And we have today around a group of senior colleagues who met him personally and who will talk about their own experiences they had with him as a person and as a colleague.
I would like to say a very quick thing about the fact that the people you will see after are people from all over the world. And this is just to introduce the idea that this tape has been wanted and desired by the International Committee of the Group Analytic Society, which is a committee of this society that tries to develop as more as possible, in the wider way possible, the contents of Group Analytic Society through workshops, seminars, and so on. So this is, and we hope you will enjoy.
This is a form of living archive. It consists of a meeting of persons who knew Michael Foulkes, SH Foulkes as he was originally entitled, his original name, who knew him when he was a consultant at the Maudsley. Pat de Maré knew him when he was working at Northfield Hospital during the war in the RAMC. Others of us knew him at the Maudsley Hospital or in the context of the Group Analytic Society, later the Institute of Group Analysis. Some of us were his patients in individual analysis or in group analysis. Michael Foulkes was a quiet man, and we've tried here to recreate something about his personality. We know about his achievements, but we don't know sufficiently what it was like to be someone who was struggling to create what is basically a new discipline. Group analysis, which in many ways was his own creation, he synthesized experiences from the past in neurology and psychoanalysis and psychology to create a new discipline. Those of us here in the group who've appreciated his work also have different perspectives on it. And some of the discussion that follows in this film will reflect some of those issues. Some of us were with him in a final group situation, which was a mixture of a seminar and a therapy group, in which he finally died. in 1976. It was a very, very hot summer in London. He shouldn't really have been working and pushing himself to continue in that hard weather, in that very hot weather. There were many struggles in that group, and I think it was a great strain upon him. What I remember, and other people will talk about this in the course of this film, was in that final group session, he was talking, and there had been some strain in the group beforehand, but that had been reconciled. He suddenly stopped talking, I think grasped his chest with his hand and said, "I'm sorry, I cannot go on." And then he collapsed, and then we tried to resuscitate him, but that wasn't possible. Now, many of us were quite close to him in the course of his work, and he would, as Lionel Krieger later on mentions, we would sometimes be summoned to go and talk to him. That would be in the guise of an invitation to dinner or to tea, and we would come and we would spend a long time with him, and I think we could see that we were being used as mirrors to him, that he was struggling to clarify and deepen his own thoughts. Sometimes he needed some opposition from us in order to be able to say, no, that is not what I think, and this helped him to clarify himself what he thought. Some of us knew him as a consultant at the Maudsley when he ran a very efficient outpatient department where large numbers of patients were treated, and I think the success of the outpatient treatment at the Maudsley was very much to his credit. I remember something which we called the McSorley effect. That is, there was one particular psychiatrist who really had very little idea of what it was like to conduct any form of psychotherapy. Michael Foulkes accepted him as someone to work in his unit. He was always confident that he could convert whoever it was working with him into an effective therapist. And after 6 months, this Dr. McSorley, who really had no idea whatsoever about how to conduct himself as a psychotherapist, was working quite successfully with us. So we felt that was a tribute to the McSorley effect. We had many visitors who came to the department. He was a man with a very wide reputation, and it was always interesting to see those visitors and the discussions that went on there, and also in the Group Analytic Society in 22 Upper Wimpole Street. Later on in this video, you'll hear something about the issues that faced us and him when we wanted to transform what was a very personal achievement, the creation of his group analytic theory and practice, into something which could be, in quotes, institutionalized. That is, where information can be transmitted by people other than the creators of the original discipline. I think to some extent, Michael Foulkes had a bit of difficulty about that, because it meant that his ideas, rather than being transmitted by him personally, would be transmitted by a group of colleagues who would then compare and contrast them with other workers in the field. So it would be falling into a perspective. But for him, it was perhaps to some extent difficult because it wasn't continuing to be his own creative achievement. But I think that in the discussion that follows, you'll have many different aspects about Michael Foulkes as a person, as a man, as a husband, as a therapist, as an innovator and a creator, and finally some discussion about what it was like for us who was with him at the end to have been there at the moment of his death, and some of the difficulties that followed on properly working through the impact of that very sudden and tragic death, although, as many people have said, perhaps for a group therapist, where better a place is there than to die in a group session.
This is just a brief biographical sketch of my late husband, SH Foulkes. Foulkes, who was my husband for the last 16 years of his life, was the youngest member in a family of 5, the children of a partner in the family firm of timber merchants, a Jewish, comfortably off family. An important influence on him was his grandmother, who lived in the same house, a handsome late 18th century house in Karlsruhe, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Baden at that time. In 1998, whilst we're recording this, he would have reached his centenary, but he died 22 years ago. He was not tall, about 5'6", comfortably proportioned, but he watched his weight as he enjoyed good food and wine. His hair turned white early, but he kept a full head of hair. He liked to dress well, correctly, but with individual touches. He was quite unaware of his good looks. He was in the German army in the First World War. After this, he decided to study medicine, and on reading Freud and other psychotherapists, he decided that would be his chosen profession. He married first Anna Staffenhagen, of whom he had a son and 2 daughters. This was in Frankfurt, where he had finished his studies, immediately after qualifying as a doctor. This was followed by 2 years in neurology with Kurt Goldstein, whom he considered his most influential teacher, apart from Freud, and from whom he absorbed the holistic approach and Goldstein's network theory. In 1928, he took his young family to Vienna for his psychoanalytic and psychiatric training. And in 1930, he returned to Frankfurt to join the newly established Psychoanalytic Institute there. This happened to share premises with the university's Department of Sociology, and there was much interchange between the two. Needless to say, this was another strong influence on Foulkes. Hitler's coming to power forced the closure of the Psychoanalytic Institute, and the family left Germany for good early in 1933. He settled in England, requalified in medicine, and began to practice as a psychoanalyst. He spoke reasonably good English, but retained a definite accent. At the beginning of the Second World War, patients disappeared to wartime occupations, and he looked for employment and found a job as a psychotherapist within a large psychiatric practice in Exeter. This drew patients from a wide area, and it was here that he first found the possibility of treating groups. Having often thought how fascinating it would be to get his psychoanalytic patients to lying on the couch day after day, week after week, to sit together, to react to each other freely. In 1942, he was called up for army service in the Royal Army Medical Corps and soon found himself at the Military Neurosis Center at Northfield, near Birmingham. He remained there until the end of his army service, contributing to the transformation of the hospital into a therapeutic community. After the war, he returned to London with his second wife, Kim Graham, whom he had married on becoming a naturalized British citizen in 1938. A year and a half after Kim's sudden death, I became the 3rd Mrs. Foulkes. I would just like to add that Foulkes felt that group analysis was a major development in psychotherapy and thought of his own contribution with a certain pride.
I met Michael, as we called him, when he was on his honeymoon with Elizabeth in Lisbon, where he gave us a conference. And I translated for my Portuguese friends, and I was marveled by his way of listening to my questions. How would you describe his way of listening? I don't know. He was just there. He was with you.
I first met him when I was quite happily doing research into music therapy, and I came to London and heard him lecture, and it changed the course of my life, of course, because I gave up my research and ended up training as a group analyst. And with Liesel, we were among the first students at the Institute of Group Analysis, and he was our teacher.
Well, I met him in 1957 in Zurich at the conference there. And I only had one meeting with him, and so I'm here under false pretenses, because I only had 3.5 hours with him. We sat out in the middle of the night with about 15 people, and we spoke most of the night. And I remember just about 3 or 4 incidents of that occasion. The first one was that a brash young man from Boston, a young analyst, confronted him and said, group therapy or group analysis is a fake, it's phony, because there's no regression. He said, you're right, he says, to a certain point, there's no regression. But we do have transferences, and we do go back in history as we relive our past without recalling it. But may I suggest something? You're talking about going into regression, which is going backward in order to go forward. Well, there's another way of looking at therapy. Let's look at the group as a forward-moving instrument. And nobody knew quite what he meant by that. He said, well, he said, take the adolescent for an example. He really has a group of peers that pull him away from the resurgence of the Oedipal conflict into the real world. And those peers have a great influence on him, as much an influence as any kind of regression, because they really set up new models for him, they give him new examples, and then they bring him into a new world, releasing him from the bondage with his parents. That is a form of influencing human character as well. Of course, everybody was taken with this kind of thing there. As somebody said to him at one point, well, how do you get trained as a group analyst? He said, well, you could come to London. We are in the process of forming an institute there now. And we would like to, we believe, he says, at least I believe that all over the world there'll be centers where people will train not in psychoanalysis, but in group analysis. He said these centers will not perhaps start right away, but in a number of years, there'll be these particular points around the globe. And he said, and I want you to think about that. Well, we did think about it. He invited us also to come to London and work there for a year. We couldn't do that, but we did consider the idea of setting up centers. And as a matter of fact, we set up a center in New York City, the Center for Advanced Group Studies, in which we were motivated by Foulkes' ideas of having an independent, freestanding institute in which we only train group analysts. In fact, we train group analysts not only from start, we train them up to the PhD level. And when they finish with us, they get a doctorate, recognized all over the country. So he stayed with us for a long period of time. Another thing happened. People asked him, well, how many people do you recommend for a group? And he said, well, generally, he said, I would say 8. So somebody spoke up. He said, you know, the person by the name of Jennings in the United States has done a lot of research from the Marino group, and she came up with the same figure. He said, well, I'm in good company. He said, that's very good. He said, but, he said, you go over 8, you have difficulties. He said, the way I work at least. And then he, some person said to him that, did he often work with many, many types of people? He said, all types. He said, it's a myth that you can't work with everybody in a group. Now, that was just a short contact I had with him. But what I remember most of all is that people sitting around in the dark there listening to him, and the light coming in from the windows on the outside. And overhead was a canopy of the Milky Way. And at the end of it, I could see various stars that were separate from the Milky Way. And I couldn't help thinking, he has different ideas, not in the stream of what's going on, but those ideas, they, now I see, are galaxies. They had it was a night I will never forget. And naturally, never forgetting it, the ideas he percolates with are still in my mind.
I experienced him as a very modest man who knew very much, who had a very noble attitude towards young therapists who had to learn. We discussed questions of the International Council of Group Psychotherapy. I then was the auxiliary secretary for the late Professor Adolf Friedemann, who did an immense work to found an international association. Also, SH Foulkes was at the origin of this organization, and he was very glad to contribute for this International Association of Group Psychotherapy, of which we have now the Congress, and which was founded in 1973.
I remember Michael for these qualities of flexibility, but also for his human qualities. He was a very warm and human person, and the thing that stands out for me is quite a personal memory, because I had experienced a personal loss at the time, and I don't know how he came to know about it, but I didn't mention it in the group, but he mentioned it and said that it was something that it was right to bring into the group, and he was extremely warm and human in that situation, and it was this sort of flexibility and these human qualities which I remember him for most, not so much for the brilliant group analytic interpretations as for that.
I don't think Irene was right in that he left the decision to us as to whether it should be a therapy group or a didactic group. In fact, the two were at loggerheads with one another practically throughout the year. We learned a lot in that group. It was very enjoyable, but the group closed after a year because the two couldn't really co-conduct it in a way which was satisfactory to both of them. Dr. Foulkes wanted to be much more didactic, and Mr. K, as we called him, was the therapist.
You're talking about his flexibility, which reminds me he could also be quite rigid and controlling, because one of the seminars we had about working in groups in a psychiatric hospital, I disagreed with him, and he spent the rest of the seminar telling me where I was wrong. And so I gradually kept quiet. And after the seminar, I went to tea with Dr. Fernando Ariave, who was one of our group, and he said to me, "One thing you've got to remember, do not disagree with Foulkes."
I met Michael in 1943, it's a long time ago. And at that time, he was a major in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and I was a captain. And we met at Northfield's Psychiatric Hospital in Birmingham. Now, at that time, he had done some groups in Exeter, as I understood from my many conversations with him. But he started to work with these very depressed and angry soldiers, whom we both had to cope with at the Northfield Psychiatric Hospital. And so I worked with him with angry and depressed soldiers. Now, in our many conversations, it became apparent that I had come from a community which was very friendly towards Jewish people. And Michael had come from a place where there was vicious anti-Semitism. And of course, he was, at that time, he wasn't very long in this United Kingdom, and became an officer rather quickly in the army. But he was a dislocated man, uprooted, and he was trying to resettle. And the contrast between his background and mine in this particular respect was very considerable. The point I really want to make, I could go into a great deal about this and our particular interaction, but the point is that one of the sources of his interest in group dynamics was his own traumatic experience with living in a hostile world. And so that has to be mentioned. The other point, and I will make only one more point, is this, that in 1958, Michael joined me at the University in North Carolina. And at that time, we were starting a new psychoanalytic institute. And at its inception, he was very helpful. He, amongst the various people who were then attempting to start an institute at the university, and it's now flourishing, the Duke University UNC Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. But at that time, of course, he was starting, and he gave an account to a small group of us who were then involved in this endeavor, and he gave repeatedly an account of his work in individual analysis. And the point I really want to make, in contradistinction to yours, was that he was a very gifted and talented psychoanalyst in individual psychoanalysis, as well as his interest in groups.
I worked for Foulkes at the Motley, and it was a very, I have a couple of pictures in my mind. One is seeing him working in a group with a supervisory group, and he knew really how to make people talk. And also, I remember him very vividly in, well, I met him when he was my age now, so, and he had plenty of hair with the beautiful white hair, and in the individual supervision. And the feeling I had, his English was not very good, mine wasn't either, or the accent at least. And he made, the idea I have is, he made me explain myself always. And that is how I learned something of group analysis, because he didn't understand, it was his look that make you think again and try to explain yourself, and that I think was a very important part of his teaching. You know how his book, his introductory book, starts with this sentence, if you remember, the Confucius, that I never repeat my lesson twice and make people explain themselves and so on. So I had a very different experience. That was before training, because I started in London, for instance, no? And he sent me to New York to be trained.
Our first child we named Michael. We both liked the name. And my husband, you must know, had no connection with Foulkes other than that he was also at the Maudsley. He was never on his firm, never in therapy with him. And then we bought a house. We were living in a flat. We bought a house in a street called Linnell Drive, which was round the corner, literally about 100 yards away from Linnell Close, where Foulkes lived. And you know, this, well, of course, it was the only house on the market that we liked, but the connection didn't really dawn on us. And about a year later, our second child was born, and we called her Elizabeth. And it wasn't until we got a card from the Foulkeses that we either of us realized what was going on.
I was a member of the last class of students to have the privilege of him as seminar leader, and I do remember his ability to encourage even the most shy of us to bring contributions to his seminar, and he had an amazing knack of making use of them. So in contrast to Meg's experience, I found myself gradually becoming more confident in that seminar. But he was a man of contrasts. There were very opposite sides to him. And as we speak, I'm remembering one of the other opposites, which was to do with his astonishing humility on the one hand, and I think I would have to say his arrogance on the other hand. And in recalling his arrogance, I remember that the only author whom we ever studied in this seminar was Michael Foulkes.
I think we're getting at a contradiction in Michael Foulkes, and that is this mixture of great modesty that has been talked about and arrogance on the other. Now, I only met him quite late in his life and early in mine, relatively, in 1971, I think it was, 5 years before he died. But I had the privilege of sitting in with him. I don't know perhaps whether that was the last year that he was taking the theoretical seminar.
I think it was. You were there.
But you're absolutely right in that he had a tremendous flexibility, but what particularly struck me was the way in which he could pick up ideas which threw light on his own. It really goes back to what I think, was it Louis Ormont was saying about the number 8. I remember in that occasion we were discussing numbers in groups, and one of the members of the student group, I think it was Sabina Stritch, made the comment that in music the largest number of musicians playing different instruments and different tunes within the composition was an octet. Now, a nonette sometimes, but otherwise you have to have instruments which are playing together. And he seized on this and said, there you are. On the other hand, it irritated me that he never spoke about other approaches to group therapy. Well, why should he? I mean, he was now towards the end of his life. He was developing and passing on to us his ideas. But it irritated me enough to take the opportunity after he died, when I was asked to take his place, which was very daunting, as a theoretical teacher, of introducing other approaches, that of Bayonne, that of Ezreal, that of Dorothy Stock-Whitaker, and so on, alongside. So we had an opportunity of seeing his ideas in context, which I thought would do justice to him, so that he could actually be seen within the context of his times. But that was something which was perhaps characteristic of him towards the end, that his own ideas were very precious to him. He was able to convey them, not with tremendous clarity, but with an evocative, almost vagueness. I mean, I think, remember the characteristic he had of starting a sentence and not finishing it.
Yeah.
And it was left hanging in the air as though for us to catch on to and develop.
When I was a student with him, that was something which I found very frustrating, coming from a background of applied science, to be taught by a man who still seemed to be searching for his frames of reference, wasn't at all satisfying. But I've come to see that that must have been an enormously valuable quality in him as a therapist. And I hope we shall have a chance to hear more from those of you who were patients of his in a group about that experience, and to discover whether I'm right in thinking that his not knowing may have been perhaps more valuable than his knowing.
He actually said and wrote somewhere that the good therapist is a therapist who can bear not knowing longer than the group. And yes, and the other thing is, it's fascinating for me to hear things I didn't know that preceded me. But